Hello and welcome to another episode of Work 2.0, the podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Wells, and this is where we talk AI, power, and the future of work. Now, the last time the world reshuffled this fast, we called it the Great Industrial Revolution. We built unions, we rewrote labor law, we had decades to adjust. This time we have mere quarters, even just a few months to adjust. My next guest is Sangeet Paul Choudary. He actually saw this coming and he calls it the reshuffle. He just wrote a book about it called The Reshuffle. It's called Reshuffle: Who Wins When AI Stacks the Knowledge Economy? Sangeet, my guest, is a Thinkers 50 ranked strategist. He's the architect of platform thinking, and he's advised Fortune 500 companies and leaders around the world. So today, he's sitting across from me to have this really important and timely conversation, not about the old question of whether AI will take your job or not. That question is old. We're here to discuss what AI is actually doing to the inherent structure of work behind closed doors, the kind of things that's not being discussed at your company's all hands meeting. Welcome, Sangeet, to Work 2.0.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Really glad to be here.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it then. Your book, Reshuffle. There's a lot of people who ask, will AI take my job? I personally feel that's the wrong question to ask. And I think you would agree as well. Your argument seems to suggest that that question is a bit too small. What do you think AI is doing to the structure of work that employees haven't been told about as yet?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to, situate this question in is this idea of jobs and why do jobs exist? Jobs exist to perform a very specific function in the economy, and typically jobs are structured around managing what was difficult to manage or what was scarce. So I'll just give a simple example. A lot of our knowledge economy jobs are structured around the idea that access to knowledge work is scarce, and that in order to access knowledge work, you need to send somebody to university for 4 years, and then you need to keep training them, and so it's expensive to access knowledge work. Well, as AI capabilities improve, we already see that some forms of knowledge work, not all, but some forms of knowledge work are increasingly much cheaper to access. But at the same time, we see that just because some forms of knowledge work become cheaper to access does not mean that the way knowledge work is performed remains the same. So the workflows and the ways in which work gets executed change significantly. I'll give a simple example over here, and there's potential for confusion as well in terms of just because you see work getting done doesn't mean that the work is actually usable. I'll give an example to illustrate that. So when we think of large language models, we assume that the one thing that large language models should definitely do really, really well is translation, because they are trained on language, they understand language, or they can understand patterns in language, they can determine based on that the reasoning and the logic that is embedded in language. And to a large extent, that's what is happening with AI today. And if you use AI for translation, large language models and the related capabilities for translation, it seems to work really well. And yet, what we don't realize is that translation requires a lot of nuance. It requires understanding tone, understanding context, and AI to a large extent is very often limited by the training set, which means that in many languages, the training set may not have been that good. And so today, when we look at translators' jobs, they are getting impacted, but it's not just AI taking away the job. There are two specific things that are happening. First, the workflow is changing because the way translators used to work in the past was very different. It was very judgment driven. It was very analyze a text, understand the context, and then translate it. Now what's being slapped onto them is here's an AI translated text, fix it because it's not getting the context right. So there are two important lessons over there. The first is that just because knowledge work seems to get done does not necessarily mean that it's usable. So we need to make a distinction between usable knowledge work that's becoming incredibly cheap to access and just visible knowledge work that is becoming cheap to access. And the second thing is that the translator example is an extreme example, but you will see this in everything that you do. The moment you start working with AI generated outputs, the workflows have to change. And those workflows again change because yesterday's workflows were structured around certain ways of working. And we'll have to rethink how workflows need to change with AI coming in. And I'll just elevate this to two other levels. It's not just the ability to access knowledge work and the workflows as a result that change. It's also the nature of the organization that can change, because just as an example, if you can train or if you can build what I would call an organizational brain, something that's trained on the context of all the work across the organization,
Mm.
that context then becomes exportable. So somebody outside your organization can work with all of your context. Say, an AI agent trained in the context of the organization can assist somebody outside to perform work with the effectiveness that could only have been performed by an employee inside the organization in the
Like a
past. So the niche.
freelancer.
Yes, but today we already have freelancers, but they do very specific structured tasks which are not context heavy. For context heavy work, we still rely on internal employees. But if you could train an agent on the context, the location of the work could change as well. So my key point is that it's not just jobs being taken away or jobs being improved. It's the logic of the job changes because certain forms of knowledge work become very easily accessible. And so the skills associated with performing them get devalued, other skills get increasingly valued. The workflows in which we participate change dramatically as well, and where work gets done, who gets to do it, and hence who has power within the organization, all of that is set to change. That's really the idea of a reshuffle. It's not just AI coming and taking jobs, it's AI changing the nature of jobs, changing the nature of how work is performed in organizations, and changing the structure of the organization itself. And if we take it one step further, changing the logic of the industry as well. And I'm happy to dig into that, but it's at all these four levels that the impact of AI plays out.
So we'll circle back to the value of jobs in a minute, because I think that's a very valid point that you raised. But just go back to your example of the translator.
Mhm.
In that instance, hypothetically, so we have translators now, their role is being redesigned around now reviewing AI output. If they're reviewing it, aren't they? I would imagine they would be training the AI on this is the bad, like wrong nuance, this is the right nuance, based on that language, that region, that dialect, whatever. So after a while, you're talking about the data set that the AI is trained on. Well, after a while, once they're training the AI based on those nuances, would we eventually get to the point where they've trained it sufficiently with all that judgment and context so that eventually the AI actually completely replaces them and then there's no need for them at all?
Yeah, increasingly the frontier of what can be reliably performed with AI gradually improves as it learns from all of this, right? But there are two elements to it. One is performance in terms of how good the performance of the AI becomes, and the other is reliability and risk. And I talk about this in the book in terms of making a distinction between tool providers and which are judged based on performance, and solution providers who need to solve a problem and hence need to be reliable and need to have a way to manage risk. So in domains where the risk is low, where the threshold for reliability is low, you could eventually get to a point where the tool provider is the solution provider, which means that AI takes over what somebody was doing. In other domains, it may not. But even in those domains, the number of people required, the structure of the job required may gradually dramatically shrink. Because if today, just as an example, if there's 20% of work that still needs to be done and that becomes 5%, not only will the number of jobs needed to manage that reduce, but increasingly that work might get collapsed and bundled into other jobs. And I take an example in the book about the typist. And when the word processor was invented, the job of the typist initially, people assume that the word processor would probably help the typist because they'll be able to type better. But what really happened was that the job of the typist went away, even though the word processor did not remove the task of typing. And that
Mm.
is because the job of the typist was structured to manage the constraint in the system, which was expensive document editing. With a typewriter, document editing was very expensive. and hence a typist was valued because they had good typing skills. So the
Mm.
moment document editing became cheap, the typists, the skill of good typing was no longer valued enough to warrant a separate job, and it got collapsed and bundled into all of our jobs. All of us type today, but we don't say typing is part of our job description. It's just
Yeah.
bundled into the thing, right? So that's also something that happens, that when the remnant work that remains with the human is so constraint free that it does not require the dedicated role to perform it, then it could just be embedded across the workflow, distributed across the workflow, and you won't have a specific job. So I think those two things are, second order effects that we don't necessarily see. What I would say alongside that is the translator example teaches us something that we need to get right today. One, just because AI can do something well does not mean that using it to remove the previous way of doing it will give you the right outputs. And so that's what we're seeing with a lot of translation. And secondly, a fallacy that we're seeing increasingly happen is that we are redesigning jobs around what AI can't do. And that's not the right way to think about this, because translators are being told to fix what AI can't do.
Mm.
Instead, we should be looking at how can we leverage AI capabilities for translators to rethink their workflow themselves. Let them think about, instead of working with the outputs, let them think about what the right workflow is. Maybe they want to develop the context first using AI, review the context, and then look at figuring out how they want to work with the output. Today, that's not what's happening, and increasingly in a lot of knowledge work, we tend to overvalue outputs to this extent that we very often misunderstand how important context is.
Mm. That is so true. That is so true. Thanks for shedding that light, that context. That really helps. So, when we're talking about again the rebundling of work, and I'm thinking, like you said, and that's a very good point about some roles could be literally like with the typist, we don't even think about it. It's just part of our workflow. So,
Right.
that's going to be interesting getting to that stage. But obviously, we know that there are jobs that are going to be completely eliminated. With AI making coordination and tasks, a lot of tasks cheaper and faster and more automated, which white collar roles become harder for a company to justify on their budget? Which ones are starting to become eliminated?
Yeah, that's there are quite a few aspects over there. So the first is the point that you mentioned about coordination, because with AI, specifically the point that I mentioned in my work is that what AI can uniquely do is it can take um, formats and inputs and information and documents from many different sources and make sense of them and enable greater coordination between different teams and tools and systems, right?
Mm.
And if you really look at our work today, our organizations, a lot of jobs were structured just to manage that coordination. There were people who were just holding teams together, project managers who were just translating different outputs between teams, who were just doing knowledge production inside the organization so that the output of one team could be used by another. Now, a lot of those things become dramatically easier to generate, easier to manage, and easier to translate across teams within the organization. So a lot of those jobs may no longer be needed simply because of the nature of the work they were doing. They were not involved in the direct value creation logic of the industry. They were doing knowledge management, and AI can do that much better. So that's one way in which jobs can start getting impacted, and already are. The second, more important and more pervasive way in which even value creating jobs, which are directly linked to the value creating logic of the industry, will and increasingly are getting impacted, is when by augmenting people, by allowing everybody to use these AI capabilities, we um, we sort of bridge the gap between the expert and the good enough, and we get the lower skilled person to start generating much higher value output. And what that ends up doing is the the skill premium that differentiated the higher skilled person from the lower skilled person, and hence allowed the higher skilled person to charge more. That skill premium is moving into the tool. It's no longer with the person. So I'll give an example of this, right? Think of before the rise of GPS based navigation. Drivers used to say London cabbies, right? They used to charge a premium for their ability to navigate the city because they built that over the years. They had to pass a specific exam about navigating the city, and only then they could be cabbies. But with the GPS based navigation coming out, that capability became democratized and available, and everybody got augmented with it. So today you never need to have driven, and you can just use GPS based navigation and become a delivery rider or an Uber driver. And what that shows is that the market or the supply of capable labor dramatically increases, because of which there's wage compression. But really, it's not just the increased competition between different providers who are now going for the same job. More importantly, what drives this is that the source of skill premium that previously was associated with the job has now gone into the tool. So in this case, the source of premium was the navigation capability, and that's been absorbed into Google Maps, and with that is captured by Google and by Uber. And so the point that I'm trying to make over here is that augmentation is not necessarily always a way to move up the ladder. And very often, it might be a way to uh, contract the skill premium and prevent you from, or remove the skill premium associated with that particular activity. So it will still be performed by a human, but the amount that you would be able to charge for it will be much lower. It may
Mm.
not justify a full role, and so all of those effects start happening as well.
So my question regarding that is, number one, wouldn't that mean that people's salaries will start to go down? If I'm a project manager or something, and the part of my role that gives me that salary premium is taken away by a tool, doesn't that naturally mean I'm going to get paid less in the future for a role where I'm getting paid six figures right now? And the other part of my question is, you mentioned a product manager as an example of a knowledge management or coordination management intensive role. Can you provide examples of more coordination and knowledge management intensive roles that could potentially be eliminated? So it's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer to the first part of the question is yes and no, in terms of, if we were to believe that the future work remains the same as the work today, then yes, we will definitely see a compression, right? We'll definitely see a wage compression. We'll definitely see lesser paid roles. No, if we believe that the future landscape of work will change, and it will change, because as AI capabilities improve, humans evolve in response. And so organizations always increasingly have this constantly evolving set of capabilities in terms of what AI can do is changing, but what their employees can do is also changing. So organizations who are able to track this well will be able to, and when I say organizations, I don't just mean the firm, but even individual teams, they will be able to better reinvent and create new value because they're seeing new capabilities emerge within. And as new capabilities emerge, new innovation opportunities emerge, the nature of work changes, and hence some high value work will also emerge out of it. But that doesn't mean that rising tide lifts all boats, because there's another distinction that's important over here, and that is that increasingly we have started seeing a divide between what I call above the algorithm work and below the algorithm work, or above the model, below the model, whatever you call it. Um,
Right.
what I mean by that, the example of taking the example of the Uber driver again, and I'll bring it back to knowledge work to make it more relevant over here. But think of the value associated with navigation going into the tool. That value is not captured in the salary of the Uber driver. It's captured in the stock returns of Uber, and hence whoever is building that algorithm and is about the algorithm, the Uber data scientist, the Uber engineer, they benefit from that value. So
Mm.
one key point is that even if the landscape of work dramatically improves and there's much more to be done, there's much higher demand, there's much more output, it will not necessarily be redistributed in a way that's evenly useful or evenly valuable for everyone. And taking this closer to knowledge work, right? I mean, when my book came out, there were quite a few people who reached out talking about how they were seeing this reshuffling happening in their work. And one very interesting example was, and I'm bringing her example as a case in the next edition of the book, which comes out this year. But essentially, this is an example of a lady who's trained at Stanford, IMD. She's trained at the top schools, and she she had been on this data analyst path, and then eventually moved into a paid marketing specialist and director of paid marketing, if you will. But all through, she was working on primarily two platforms, Meta and Google. And what happened was that a couple of years back, both Meta and Google, um, they had learned so much from the judgment that a director of paid marketing or paid campaigns was performing, that most of the campaign optimization logic, which used to be performed by a user of these platforms, has now been absorbed into the platform. And so at the age of 40, she suddenly doesn't have a job because she's been pushed below the algorithm. So she's been getting job requests or job offers, but they're less than what she used to earn 16 years back.
Uh-huh.
and and that's because the only jobs left in the industry are not judgment oriented campaign optimization or campaign structuring jobs, but they are more entry level jobs left over there because they're all below the algorithm. So that's, those are some interesting effects of the reshuffle that we are already seeing out there.
Right. And then just going back to the other question, can you list some examples of specific roles? Just quickly list like specific roles that you think would fall under that category of being completely taken like below the algorithm, no longer needed.
I think it's really it's difficult to plot it at the level of roles. It's really a function of um, to uh, you know to what extent the primary um, judgment in your job. Because if you look at the primary judgment that is there in driving, yes, there is a significant amount of judgment involved in driving itself, but navigation was the knowledge work component, if you will. And
Yeah.
similarly, in campaign management, the campaign structuring, the campaign optimization was the knowledge work, not so much the setting up the copy and things of that sort. And so when you work alongside an algorithm or model, or there is a trained model coming in from outside that is able to absorb that judgment, that is when you see this shift between above the algorithm and below the algorithm happening.
So when companies often tout AI as, this is there to empower our workers, should employees believe them? Who's really capturing the value? Is it really for the workers or is it for someone else?
Well, it's a mixed bag today, because um, there should be a very credible path for AI to empower workers, and that the onus for a lot of that falls on the company, but also on the employee. On the company, because a company should think about, not about how are people adopting my tools, but really about figuring out what else can I do now that AI capabilities are improving. But if as a CEO I can track how my employees are changing, what new capabilities they're developing, that is, we really need to have that kind of real-time view on what capabilities are available within the company as we deploy AI. How is that changing? Because if you're not looking at that, if you're just looking at how is AI helping you speed up work, eventually you will see a distinction between two kinds of roles where AI speeds up work and allows the role to stay back, and roles where AI speeds up work to the extent that it can take up work itself and perform it, and the logic of the job goes away. So if you just focus on speeding up and improving your work as it stands today, eventually you'll end up in this bifurcation. But if both at a company level, but as a leader of a team, even as an individual, if you constantly think about, as AI capabilities are changing, what else can I do? What commoditized capabilities can I use from outside, and what new things can I do? That is when you really think about reimagining your work. So I believe the potential with AI is incredible, but you have to reimagine your work. I'll give a very simple example closer to home. So the last time I created a website for my previous book, it took me like a year of work with an agency, um, more than $15,000 to get it done, and a lot of back and forth, a lot of time. Um, 2 days or 3 days back, I sort of vibe coded my new website in 24 hours. Or
Wow.
four. It took 4 of my hours. It's just that I vibe coded it in a day. So in 4 hours, I did that, and the website is actually much more interesting than it was for the previous book. It works off my It creates a live representation of all the ideas of my book. It's highly interactive. And
Mm.
that's an example of using AI capabilities, applying your judgment to see what new things you can do. And so you have to think about what's more interesting and what new problems you can solve with all the capabilities available. And with that, how does the capabilities, what new capabilities should you develop in order to move in that direction? And
So
that's the only way you can reimagine work.
So ultimately, when it comes to who's capturing the value, you feel like it's definitely for employees, but it's about how you think about it. Like if you're just going to sit there and as an organization and just say we're going to throw AI into what we're already doing and without reimagining your workflow, then no one's capturing that value, right? So like in with your instance, instead of what you did, you completely reimagined. You didn't even go to an agency. You just did it yourself in a few hours, in a fraction of the cost as well. So that's incredible. I'm curious to know as we close up the interview, with the knowledge economy being reshuffled, I want to know from you what's the type of professional in 2026 and beyond that is about to become dangerously overvalued. We know what kind of roles are going to be expendable. What are the core traits of the professional in this era that's going to be overvalued?
Yeah, I think the single most important trait is the ability to be entrepreneurial. That is, you don't rely on a specific career path for your company. You don't rely on your company to show you where you're headed. You're entrepreneurial. You're constantly solving problems. You're using um, your skills, your capabilities, but you're constantly looking at what's possible with AI. How can you use that to solve fundamentally new problems? And hence, how can you ensure that you're constantly learning new capabilities and moving further? But the most important thing is to be entrepreneurial. What that means in this scenario is that you have to think about new ways of solving your customer's problem. You have to think also about, if you're working inside a company, think about what's the landscape of the industry going to look like a year from now, and hence, given that, place bets on what will be valued a year from now, and
Right.
then start moving in that direction. But then be aware of the fact that that's going to change every day. So keep your radar on and keep reviewing your map and keep improving your map as you move forward. The only way to do this is to move towards bet on a future goal and move towards that and keep improving your ability to sense that change. And I'll make a couple of points over here. It's very easy to get distracted by do work faster, cheaper, and probably at I would say better, but not in a fully reimagined way, right? And if I take the example of the website building that I talked about just now, an easy way to um, see it would be that it was done faster and cheaper. But what would be missing from that is that I was able to build fundamentally new things that I would not have built in the past. I was able to build a live index of how different industries are getting reshuffled. I was able to build a live interactive map of the different topics in the book, and that is, a lot of that is about reimagining what are new ways to solve your customer's problem. So
Mm.
just because you have the tools, don't just go faster, better, cheaper. Think about what's a fundamentally new way to solve your customer's problem. So I think that's really the key thing. You have to be entrepreneurial, because there is no fixed formula on. Um, Even the companies would like to um, you know measure things like tool adoption. There is no link between that and the right outcomes. So you have to be entrepreneurial and constantly keep improving your map.
Got it. Now, just as we round up this interview, obviously you've probably heard of, I'll say a corny cliche phrase that says, AI won't replace your job, but someone using AI will. We've heard that a lot. How would Sangeet rewrite that phrase?
um, I I would say AI. I obviously have a lot to say about that phrase, and in the book I tear it apart. But the way I would rewrite it is, AI won't take your job, but if you re- but but it might help you reimagine it. So
Mm.
that's what I would. I mean, there's a big might over there, because not everybody, just because you're confronted with uncertainty but also have access to these capabilities, not everybody resorts to reimagining. A lot of people get into panic mode. So the might is the operative word over there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Sangeet. And for those of you listening, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Work 2.0, the podcast. Please go ahead and rate this podcast, comment under this episode, share this episode with a coworker, your team, friend, or family member, and follow us on Spotify, Substack, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your podcast. And I'll be back with you next week, Monday, on Work 2.0, the podcast.